Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this March 2023 presentation of the Jacksonville Historical Society's Speaker Series program. As always, the Speaker Series is underwritten by Retina Associates, Drs. Mansour Duval and Fred Landro. I am Alan Bliss. I'm the CEO of the Jacksonville Historical Society. And welcome also to Old St. Andrew's Church. The Historical Society has been honored for about the last 25 years to be the stewards and custodians of this 1888 vintage church that is one of the few survivors and one of the few religious structures to survive the Great Fire of 1901. The Jacksonville Historical Society itself is now in its 94th year, having been founded on May 3rd, 1929 in the Carling Hotel. We are now on a glide path to our own centennial. 94 years of preserving and sharing Jacksonville's many fascinating stories and advocating for the understanding and education and historic preservation of the history of this city. Thanks also to the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville and the City of Jacksonville for their support for the work of the Historical Society, as well as for numerous corporate partners of the Historical Society, including Haskell, the Marks Gray Law Firm, MyStar Credit Union, and others. Philanthropic foundations such as the Dolores Barr Weaver Fund and the Henry Ruth Gooding Foundation, and numerous significant donors, and also our members. And I hope that includes every one of you here in this church this evening. If there are any of you who are not yet members, we can remedy that condition with some of the literature that's available at the welcome table, and we would really be honored to have you with us at any level that you deem appropriate. I want to thank also the staff of the Jacksonville Historical Society, our volunteers and board members, several of whom are present. If you are a board member or a former board member of the Historical Society, would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you very much, Dr. Wood at the back. Maggie Lees, thank you. And staff and volunteers, Chief of Staff Kate Halleck, and numerous others at the tables in the back and at the welcome table. Thanks to all of you. We couldn't do what we do without all of those resources. History, as I said, is what we advocate for in general. Education and understanding. We believe at the Historical Society that an understanding of the place that you live, whether it's your house, your neighborhood, your city, your state, or your country, is elemental to appreciating that place and having a sense of place. It leads to a stronger sense of intellectual and psychic and spiritual and economic investment in that place. In other words, history helps promote good citizenship. That's the value proposition of historic education. And we think that understanding the history of a place as complicated as Jacksonville really has meaning and has value. This is a great city. Florida's largest city in physical size, largest in population, and for my money, more interesting and complicated than any other place in Florida. I say that with all due respect to our friends to the south in St. Augustine. Yes, they measure their foundational date from 1565, and I respect that, but what's happened down there since then, right? In Jacksonville, on the other hand, the drama, the excitement, the change, the innovations, it just never stops in this city. And the pulse and the heartbeat of this place really energizes me. I feel lucky to be here, and I feel lucky to have a position that connects me with so much of the stories that really contribute to our identity here. Well, I've said a little bit about history. Let me just say something about the subject of this evening's program, courthouses. County courthouses are unique in the experience of civic life and in the function of any organized society. In America, in Florida, county courthouses are where the rule of law really meets the day-to-day experience of citizens. It is where the members of the judiciary and the administrators and staff of the court system dispense and enforce and apply the law. And at some point, that affects every citizen in a place, does it not? And so the history of courthouses really is interwoven with the whole civic experience of people who live in a place. I'm looking forward to learning more from Judge Cofer about that this evening. Before we get to that, I'm going to welcome Jacksonville attorney and history-minded citizen and former Jacksonville Historical Society board chair, Edward Booth Jr., known to his friends as Skip. And I really appreciate your long service to this organization, Skip, your history-minded citizenship, and appreciate you being here to introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I'm Ed Booth, and I want to welcome everybody this evening, and a special welcome to members of the judiciary who have come tonight. This is a very interesting program about the 5 courthouses that we have utilized in 200 years of Jacksonville history. This program is kind of a natural progression from our celebration of the city's bicentennial last June, because one of the first things our forebears did after founding Jacksonville was establish a court system. And it goes to what Alan said about the rule of law. And this is a fascinating program that will teach you things you probably didn't know about. That our courthouses were used for protection against invading Indian tribes, Russians waging nuclear war on us, that sort of thing. And I think it'll be very interesting. Pleased to have my old friend Charlie Cofer tonight. Judge Cofer has had an illustrious legal career spanning a little more than 45 years. After graduating from the University of Virginia Law School, came to Jacksonville, went to work for the Mahoney Adams firm, and decided to get some trial experience by joining the public defender's office. And he's one of the more experienced trial attorneys here in Jacksonville. He was appointed to the bench, I believe, was at Lawton Childs in 1998, and served with distinction, and would have rode on off into the sunset into retirement, but he rose to the occasion in cleaning up his old employer, the public defender's office. We can do a whole program on the things that happened, and Judge Funk just pointed out to me the reason we know Charlie's doing a good job is because we never read about him. But I'm very interested to hear his presentation, and if you would give a warm welcome to Charlie Cofer.
Thank you, Skip, for the kind introduction. One of my campaign slogans was, "You'll never hear from me again." I want to thank the Jacksonville Historic Society for inviting me here this evening to talk about Jacksonville's courthouses. I know Skipper over time has done a lot of research, and I've built on that. I'm a little apprehensive about talking to a historical society because I don't view myself as a historian. I'm not trained in history or doing histories, but I've always been fascinated by it. So please judge my presentation by the fact that I'm a rank amateur. During the process of moving our courthouse from the Bay Street Courthouse that most of you all have grown up knowing to the new Adams Street Courthouse, I started becoming concerned about whether or not things were being inventoried that were of value that should be taken to the new courthouse. And so Judge Day was one of the 2 judges primarily in charge of getting the new courthouse together. So I went in to talk with him to suggest that somebody inventory the Bay Street Courthouse. Lance looked at me and goes, "You got the job." So that's what got me started on this. After spending some time on the effort at looking at the Bay Street Courthouse about what could and should be saved, I came to the conclusion, unfortunately, that there wasn't a whole lot that could be saved. But this is a story really about some things that we were able to save and some things that we lost. And that's what happens when you have transition in time. So I know Skip already said that there were 5 Jacksonville courthouses. How many courthouses do you all think we've had here in Jacksonville?
According to the picture, it's a lot more.
You know, 5 I think is kind of the generally accepted number, but you can fudge on it, and there may be some other facilities that would qualify as courthouses. But I'm going to be focusing primarily on what are the 5 primary courthouses. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about Jacksonville history that I know that this group is probably very well aware of. Most of you all know that Jacksonville was actually created on August 12, 1822. It was named for William Pope Duval, the first territorial governor of Florida, the first non-military territorial governor. And Jacksonville had been settled at this location of a ford across the St. Johns River, which had existed since prehistoric time. The land on the south of the river of the ford was owned by Isaac Hendricks, and the land on the north side of the ford, where Jacksonville downtown was to grow, was owned by Lewis Hogan's, John Brady, and Isaiah D. Hart. Those gentlemen actually got involved in platting the town, beginning in 1822, and the first street laid out was called Market Street, and the second was called Bay Street after some prominent Bay Street, according to history. And at that time, the town of Jacksonville was located along the Kings Road that led to the ferry at the foot of what has become known as Liberty Street. So when it became known that Jacksonville had been selected as a county seat for Florida, or for Duval County, John Brady actually donated a lot at the northeast corner of Market and Forsyth Street, and the lot was valued at $15, to Benjamin Chairs and Francis J. Ross in trust to be conveyed to the county as a site for a courthouse. So he did that deeding, but nothing really happened. They contracted in October of 1823 with a John Doggett to build a courthouse, but the efforts to actually build a facility were not made immediately. In 1823, the legislature made some changes in the original method of county government and appointed new judges. Up to that point, they had appointed judges, but the judges were really more in the nature of county commissioners. So they changed the structure and actually appointed actual judges. And on the last day of November that year, people traveled to Jacksonville for the opening of a true court. All that was there was a lot with trees on it, no building. So by 1825, there still was no public building designated for use as a courthouse. But after the city was surveyed, John Warren had erected a large 2-story building at the northwest corner of Bay and Newman Street, which eventually became the location where Bailey Publishing Company served for many years. And the eastern end of this first story was used as a store. The western end was used as a dwelling. The upper floor was just one large room. It was used as an informal courtroom until the first courthouse could be built. The Superior Court of the territory shared the hall and held 2 or 3 terms in this space. And this room was also used as a dance hall, used for theatrical presentations, and occasionally to hold religious services. So, building preparations for the courthouse were started in 1824, but actual construction did not begin until the summer of 1825. And in my reviewing records, newspaper reports, and books, what it sounds like was something more akin to a barn raising. They had immense hewn timbers of oak and solid heart pine for framing the building that were hauled to the lot in August. And once they were laid out, the people of the county gathered and raised them in 2 days under the direction of Seymour Pickett. Once this was done, Chairs and Ross deeded the lot to the county. It was done on July 13th of 1825, probably know, in compliance with the trust and Brady. This courthouse was a structure 40 feet square and 2 stories high with a basement which was 10 feet in height. The building remained in this unfinished state for more than 3 years, with only the framing standing. And as noted by one writer who came through Jacksonville in late 1825, this was in one of the newspapers, the building appropriated for the use of the court would scarcely be considered fit for a barn. It is open to the wind and rain at almost every point of the compass. There is, indeed, the frame of a pretty large courthouse erected, which has the appearance of having been in that state for some time. Nothing has been done to it. By the winter of 1825-26, the basement was roofed over, and subsequent terms of court were held there when the weather was good. When the weather was bad, the court often returned to the multi-purpose hall over John Warren's place at the corner of Bay and Newman Street. During the period of 1828-29, the framing was boarded in and a roof was put on. The temporary hewn timbers supporting the construction were removed, and brick pillars were built, and the building was correctly leveled. Now, this courthouse faced Forsyth Street looking south toward the river. Now, there are no photographs of this courthouse, but imagine a building with a long, broad portico supported by brick pillars fronting the building, and broad steps leading up to it from the ground on both east and west sides of the portico. Behind these steps was an entrance to the basement, a large double door about 10 feet high, led to the inside, and broad steps led up on the east and west sides of the building to the upper story. The windows were numerous and of great size, and they were shutters of white pine provided, which were later replaced by sash windows, when they could be obtained. So the building was still not complete. In fact, by 1834, the county had failed to pay John Doggett for the work which had already been completed. So, although the structure had been raised and boarded, it remained unfinished still for a few years. Measures were taken to complete the building, which was also supposed to be used for a schoolhouse. But the difficulties confronting the county authority in raising funds were well documented because they petitioned the U.S. government to complete it because the territorial government wound up using it more than the state government. The federal government started paying a little bit of rent for the building, but ultimately, the people of Jacksonville had petitioned the territorial legislature for permission to run a lottery in order to raise the $6,000 needed to complete the courthouse. Yeah, so imagine that you're given the authority to run a lottery to raise $6,000 to complete a courthouse. And guess what? The people running the lottery got to retain 6% of the proceeds. Now, Lance is sitting here salivating, thinking, if I could have gotten 6% of the Adams Street courthouse. So the act authorizing the lottery allowed the people to collect a fee of 6%. And a lot of people think of lotteries as gambling, and so they picked as trustees to run this lottery people who were deacons of the churches and the sort, to just kind of cast away any claim that they were gambling. So that act was passed by the city council, or the lottery was passed by a city council on February 7th, 1834, and the managers got to retain 6%. All right, now, in my research about the 100th anniversary of this courthouse, I came across an article in the Florida Times Union, in microfilm, of an artist's rendition of what the courthouse looked like. this is the closest I know. It doesn't exactly jive with the descriptions that I have, but this is what the courthouse was supposed to look like. You can see it wasn't real fancy. To give you some idea of the size of this 40 by 40 courthouse, if y'all have been in the new courthouse, it would fit easily into the atrium. The whole thing. So, but anyway, that's the only rendition of it that I have found. Now, this courthouse was finally completed after they sold the lottery in the 1840s. And while the building was one of the best structures in Jacksonville at the time, it was quickly viewed to be inadequate. So, by 1852, the city sent out a notice soliciting bids for mechanics and builders to build a new courthouse. So that started going on, but apparently the approaching Civil War stalled the efforts to build a new courthouse. As y'all are probably familiar from the Civil War history of Jacksonville, the federal troops occupied Jacksonville multiple times. They would come, I believe, probably 2 to 3 times. Whenever they did so, Jacksonville tried to send messages to the federal troops saying, look, we're not going to put up any opposition, don't destroy our town. But eventually on one of the visits, they did destroy the town and burn a lot of structures. During their evacuation, federal troop evacuation, which occurred on March 29, 1863, federal soldiers burned down this courthouse and the St. John's Church and many other homes in that portion of town. Now understand, this courthouse was built at the northeast corner of Market and Forsyth Street, and it was facing the river, facing south toward the river. So, no courthouse. So what happened? This is the Freedmen's Building. After the courthouse was burned, the court system basically became vagabonds. The Freedmen's Building was used by the court system for a number of years during Reconstruction in order to hold court proceedings. And that was located at the southwest corner of Main and Forsyth. By 1883, Jacksonville's financial condition had improved to the extent that it became practical to build a new courthouse financed by a scrip issue secured by a special tax levy. So this second courthouse, is what I'm probably sure that you are all familiar with, was built on the site of the one burned in 1863, but instead of facing south, it faced west. And so it faced Market Street instead of Forsyth Street. The contract for this building was let in April of 1884 to T.M. Anderson for $75,000. Work started at once, and the cornerstone of the new courthouse was laid with Masonic rites on July 24, 1884. Now remember that date, because that's going to have an interesting portion of the latter portion when I talk, the laying of the cornerstone. This particular cornerstone weighed 1.5 tons and was the largest artificial stone ever made in the state up to that time. Numerous artifacts and documents were sealed in the cornerstone during this ceremony. And I'll be talking a little bit more about it. And let me go back. Imagine this cornerstone laying was one of the biggest events in Jacksonville's history, including a parade from the area near where the Prime Osborne Center is, all the way to town, and then the inclusion of a number of items into the courthouse, kind of a time capsule, what we call a time capsule today. So, construction began in 1884, and the building was occupied in 1886. The foundations of this thing was overbuilt. I The foundations were 3 feet below the surface and 5 feet in width. The completed building was 118 feet long by 66 feet wide. It was 2 stories high. The Market Street entrance to the building was dominated by a 5-story clock tower. Now, I was able to find some depictions of this particular courthouse, the floor plans in the Times Union article from the period. And this would be the first floor. The typical entrance, Market Street entrance here, and then you had a double staircase going upstairs. And like most of our courthouses, after that and up until the present one, it was a multi-use facility. For example, you have a grand jury room here. The sheriff office had an office there, waiting room for jurors and witnesses, the tax collector, probate department, judge's office, and the school system. All have offices in this particular courthouse. And it's very similar to the courthouse, the old courthouse up in Fernandina. The second floor, here again is a double staircase, had a single courtroom with a jury room and a judge's chambers. So it's a classic late 1800s Florida courthouse. Now, here's an interesting thing. One of the newspaper articles, after describing the dimensions, made this observation. The building is built of Florida brick, faced with the finest Philadelphia pressed brick laid in white mortar. The trimmings are of artificial stone. The style of architecture is Gothic. The building is fireproof, with the exception of the roof, the frame of which is yellow pine covered with slate on the slopes and tin on the deck. And it goes on to talk about the gutters and the ceiling and how all the offices. So anyway, this is a view of that courthouse, which would have been basically kind of on the Market Street side of where the Bay Street courthouse would be. So this would be Bay in front of you, Market Street going up the hill. So, what happened in May, 1901? The fire of May 3rd, 1901 destroyed most of the city, including the 1886 courthouse. It was not as fireproof as they thought. Court functions were handled temporarily in the old Duval Athletic and Social Club and then transferred to the Mason building. There's kind of an interesting talk from the paper the next day after the fire that let me read. On Friday, May 3rd, 1901, the courts had scarcely finished the morning's business when the Great Fire of 1901 started. Most of what is known as downtown Jacksonville was consumed by the fire, which began in the La Villa area and spread eastward through downtown. As the fire spread toward the courthouse, Judge Phillips transferred many of the records of his office to the vault. So they viewed the loss of this courthouse as being $60,000. Within a day or two, Judge Call convened the circuit court and allowed the term to lapse. They actually convened the circuit court in an old gambling parlor. The notes are that the session was called to order by the sheriff, who rapped on a roulette wheel for order, and the judge occupied a faro table. And so there were about 20 members of the bar present, and they shut it down until they could find a more suitable place. During the period after the fire, court proceedings moved quite often from different places, the Duval Athletic and Social Club and whatnot. What's incredible about, you've probably all seen the fire, and this is where the courthouse would be here at Market and Forsyth. And so this is what the that building looked like after the fire. The brick was fireproof, but nothing else. And this is a side view looking south on Market Street. One of the interesting things about this fire is while some of the court records were saved, all of Jacksonville's property records were destroyed. Have y'all ever seen the old-fashioned books where property records were kept? They're about that thick, yay by yay. They were all destroyed. But fortunately, there were a couple of title companies in town whose records were preserved. And so within a matter of days, the clerk of court was able to get with the title companies, borrow their records, and start reconstructing the title company books. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story about getting those preserved if we have time. So, here is the miracle. May 3rd, 1901. How long did it take for them to occupy and have a new courthouse built? Guesses? It was about 18 months between the fire. Bids went out in the summer. They had started construction probably the 1st of 1902, and they were in the building by the end of 1902. It's pretty incredible how quick they did. Lance?
The Adams Street.
How long did it? 11 years for the Adams Street. Yeah. So Rutledge Holmes was chosen as the architect for this project, and the deadline for construction bids was January of 1902. The bidding amount, the request for proposals requested that the new courthouse be built for $75,000. All the bids were over, so they went back to Rutledge Holmes. I guess they did some, what do they call it? Value engineering to get it under $75,000, and so they got it done. So April 7th of 1902, the cornerstone for this burned-out courthouse was located and open, and they were able to recover all of the coins and items that were put into that courthouse cornerstone. And as they laid the cornerstone for the new courthouse, which I call the 1902 courthouse, they put them in and then added more stuff into that cornerstone. And the new cornerstone was laid on April 14th, 1902 during another Masonic ceremony. So, y'all are probably very familiar with this particular courthouse. From an architectural style, this building looks sometimes very close to what was City Hall that was built a couple of blocks away. Sometimes they're confused, but this is the actual courthouse. And it was ultimately completed in November, and they had some cost overruns, so don't worry about that, man. It's okay. It's $100,000 it cost them. That was secured through a bond issue. The county commissioners accepted the new building in November, and they had a grand opening during the gala week, November 25th through 30th of 1902. And this was to commemorate the first phase of rebuilding of Jacksonville. So it was a pretty significant thing. Now, so there are not many photographs. I have a lead on some more photographs of the interior, but there are only a few photographs I'm aware of the interior. This is the Council for the Blind Center, and then a little snack bar, and you can see a stairwell in the back. Now, they still had the brick walls of the 1886 courthouse, and they were going to tear them down, but something else had burned during the fire, and it was the Jacksonville Armory, and it actually got burned to the ground. And so the decision was to save some money and build a new armory around the walls of the 1886 courthouse. So look at this picture. That's the burned 1886 courthouse. And this is the building they built around it, a new armory for Jacksonville. Historically, this served as an armory for a while until they built a new one. And this building was renovated into Juvenile Hall. Some of you folks who got into trouble as youth might have been down there. And then ultimately, that building was re-renovated into offices for the fire department. And unfortunately, the remnants of that were torn down before I really got started on this project. Now, this shows the relationship between the two buildings. This would be the old 1886 courthouse with the new armory skin, and that would be the Market Street, the 1902 courthouse. And this is the northeast corner of Market and Forsyth, where that building would have been after it was torn down. So, all right. Now, I gather it because of the rapidity of and necessity to be cost effective in building the 1902 courthouse. Jacksonville was really booming after the fire. And so that building became somewhat, it was space confined. They needed more space for the courthouse. And so ultimately, they built an annex behind it. All right? Now, that annex, this courthouse is no longer present, of course, but the annex is still there. It's the Yates building in town. When the 1902 courthouse was sold, it was sold to a law firm here in town that ultimately, and they tore the main courthouse down to use as a parking lot and occupied what is now the Yates building for the law offices. And then it became a bank, and then ultimately the city got back and renovated it for the tax collector and some other city offices. But you can see this is the best comparison I can make of those two. Now, this building was also built around the same time. After they decided to build the annex and got it started, they realized they still needed more room. So this building was designed by Henry Courthouse. It was down on Liberty Street, and it was a criminal courthouse and jail. Basically, my understanding is that facility would handle misdemeanors and felonies, whereas the 1902 courthouse handled civil cases and capital cases. The only criminal cases handled in that building were homicide cases where the death penalty is involved. So during this time period, beginning about it, the annex was built in 1914, if I remember correctly. This followed a little bit later. You had two courthouses basically going on at the same time. So the permit for this building was issued March 19th of 1915, and let me see, okay. So, moving along, the fourth courthouse. This is a courthouse most of the lawyers in here had some time of serving in. This is a photograph taken shortly after the courthouse was built. The reason I love this photograph is you can still see the tower of the 1902 courthouse over here. And it's before the parking lot was built and still has some of the ships from the shipyards being constructed. Ultimately, after the law firm bought that lot, they tore that down. There was a huge parking lot built out over the water. I have a set of keys still on the floor of the river because of the cracks in it. So everybody who ever parked in that thing probably dropped something that went through the cracks in that. So this building was erected at a cost of $6,908,000 and was designed and engineered by the local firm of Reynolds, Smith and Hills. And the George D. Auchter Company served as a general contractor, and most of the subcontract work was performed by Jacksonville businesses. So now we get into stuff we can say and we can't. So again, this was a multi-purpose courthouse. It also served the clerk of court, tax collector, tax assessor, property appraiser, the sheriff, board of county commissioners, state auditor, all of these different groups. By the time we left, the only groups there still were a portion of the state attorney's office and the clerk of court. All the other groups had been pushed out. I remember when I started with the public defender's office, a portion of our space was from what the agricultural department had vacated, so they didn't leave anything good though. All right, so this was that courthouse. This is a photograph the last day that we occupied the courthouse, and I was fortunate enough to sneak onto Shad Khan's yacht that was docked behind there. They made me take my shoes off. And so I got that great photograph the last day we were there. And this is what became of it. So let's talk about things we can preserve. Do any of y'all remember coming down to the courthouse and remembering this sculpture over the elevators? Yeah, all right. I think Judge Moran used to call this Mom Pa Kettle. He had some nickname for it, but really the actual name of this sculpture is Law and Liberty. And it was a centerpiece, somewhat controversial, you might expect, because this was put in the late 50s, and it's a classic type sculpture. And it was mounted above the elevator. And the interesting thing is they put out a request for proposals, and the person that actually won the design contest was a person who had come from Jacksonville, a Sheldon Bryant, who, yes, is a member of the Bryant family. Sheldon went to high school here, graduated from Jackson High School, and then actually went to New York to study art and sculpture, and did most of his work there. This actual sculpture was cast in Brooklyn, New York by Eugene Betty. And the sculpture focused on two primary figures. The first was a 9-foot bronze figure of a man carrying an unfurled scroll as a symbol of law. The second is a 9-foot bronze figure of a woman carrying a torch as a symbol of liberty. 4 stars, and unfortunately this got cropped a little bit, you can't see it. There were 4 stars on each corner, kind of fashioned in the constellation Libra, which is a symbol of balance in the zodiac. Each of these figures weighs approximately 500 pounds. It took Brian 6 months to do the sketches for the sculpture. The figures were first modeled in clay and then cast in plaster Paris to form a mold for the casting. And then it was transported to Betty's foundry in Brooklyn for the casting process. And then after casting, Brian and Betty came down to supervise the installation process. Now, you all probably don't know who Eugene Betty is or who his founder is, but think of the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, which depicts the raising of the flag in Iwo Jima. That is Betty's work. Okay, so it shows that Jacksonville really took the time to do a quality structure. I will tell you, during the process, one of the things that we were able to preserve, I want to thank Lance for helping us, is going in and getting these out of the courthouse. And they're presently over in the new courthouse in storage. I'll tell you a quick story. I was working with the Cultural Council for a while about the artwork that they want to put outside. And I've always wanted to find a place for this sculpture because it's absolutely beautiful. And so I said, would y'all mind coming down and looking at this? And they came down to the basement and looked at this, and they were just taken aback. I thought this thing might be worth $25,000, $30,000. And I asked them, give me a ballpark estimate. How valuable is this sculpture? And they said, that's probably a $500,000 sculpture. And it's sitting in storage, but I'm determined to find a place for it.
Who's our new chief judge?
So, the other side, the other form of artwork, and this is one of the things lost. There were, on the river side of the courthouse, there were these brick sculptures. It's what they call an ancient art of the Babylonians known as baked brick carving. And these panels were executed by artist Earl LaPont in 1957. And if I remember correctly, there were 3 or 4 of them depicting various stages of the history of Florida. And unfortunately, because of how they were, there was some effort to try to preserve them when they tore it down, but they just couldn't be preserved. So that is part of what was lost. So in June of 1958, when this courthouse was built, they were able to locate the cornerstone from the 1902 courthouse, add it to some more stuff, and put it into a cornerstone of this courthouse. So, I hope to find a video to show the recovery of that tonight, but we're still looking for it. We actually, and Judge Day helped on this, a couple of weeks before we vacated the Bay Street Courthouse, Judge Day took a number of trustees out with sledgehammers. There was no place on the architectural plans that showed where the cornerstone was, but I had a guess that it was behind a plate that had 1958 inscribed on it that had been damaged. And Judge Day supervised a number of trustees with sledgehammers, and they wailed away at that wall. Maybe I ought to have you down. And finally, they uncovered this huge, it was about that thick, about this big, sheet metal box that had all the contents from the 1886 cornerstone and the 1902 cornerstone. And they had been put into our cornerstone. A little bit more about that later. So, one of the things we did, and Judge Day came up with this idea, is since there had been time capsules of sort in the 1886 and 1902 and 1958 courthouses, we should display them and start a new time capsule. How many of y'all have been into the Adams Street Courthouse?
Too much.
Okay. You walk in and there's this obelisk there. Judge Day I give him credit for really spearheading that obelisk. And what we did, it was a debate whether we put all the items into another time capsule or retain them, since most of them were over 100 years old at that point, for public display. And so the decision was made to kind of start over and invite people throughout the community to come in and donate items to put in to the new time capsule. And somehow I felt we needed to make a connection. This is a photograph that was taken out of the time capsule where we recovered it from Bay Street. And you can see here, these are county commissioners who are looking at the time capsule back in the 50s when they recovered it from the 1902 courthouse. From that courthouse. And so this is photograph within a photograph. This is just more of them. Here's one of the interesting things. Y'all probably can't see this. New York Herald, dated April 1865, announcing the assassination of President Lincoln. Now, I don't know whether that was put into the 1886 courthouse time capsule or if it was put in the 1902 one. I have a feeling it might have been put in the 1902 because it doesn't show any real heat damage, but it is a very brittle thing. When we did the dedication of the time capsule, this is the box that Judge Day and his trustees recovered, and all these different papers, photographs. This was the thing that most people just loved looking at, a mid-1950s Jacksonville phone book. And the reason is people who were born in Jacksonville or raised wanted to go in and they could remember their phone numbers and they'd go in and look up their parents' names and see if they had the phone numbers. So all of these things, almost all of these items, are now under lock and key in the chief judge's chambers. And it was just really interesting. We did a display like this. This is a display that was done at City Hall, but we had it all laid out and we had the dedication of the new courthouse and the loading of the new time capsule. The interesting thing was coins. When I read the articles about the dedication of the 1886 courthouse, it talked about how people from all over the city and all over the country donated coins to be put into that courthouse. And you can still see when you look at it, there's some scorching from the 1901 fire. This is the badge of an Officer Van Sant. You tell by the badge number. We didn't have that many police officers back in 1886. So this is his badge, and he must have taken it and donated it into the time capsule. Now, this is one of my favorite things. A nickel. If you look up here, I, Theodore Hartridge, placed a nickel in the cornerstone in 1903, when I was a young boy. So here is another nickel. So this young man, I think his uncle was the state attorney here in town. They actually had a house on Forsyth Street, not far from the courthouse. When he was a young child, he went to the cornerstone laying of the 1902 courthouse, put a nickel in it, and then came back on the cornerstone laying in the probably 1957 and put this new nickel with tape in it and the note. So, I came up with the idea. I'm real proud of this. I wanted some connection between cornerstone and cornerstone with our new cornerstone. So I actually started researching this man and found that his daughter-in-law was still alive in Jacksonville and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren were still alive. So I went through all the coins that we had and there was only one other nickel in that group of coins. So I took that nickel, this nickel, and then I invited the Partridge family to bring another nickel, and we put it in a shadow box in the new courthouse. So, anyway, that was a fun thing to do. And I think they really appreciated the history of their grandfather and father and father-in-law. This was the Hartridge family house. This is Dr. Theodore Hartridge, so I think it was his son who put the first nickel. I think it was his brother who became the state attorney. And there's a proud owner of our time capsule, Judge Day. This was a real fun project. It just seemed the work would come in the weekend before and putting it together. We took a lot of photographs. But it's a really good thing, dedication. And hopefully in 100 years or whenever people who are not in this room make the decision, they'll open it up and just explore the different aspects of Jacksonville's history when it comes in. So, law and liberty. My goal for law and liberty. I would love to see this restored in some place. And we've had some efforts and they've stalled. Some of it is where, how, and whatever. The Bryan family has been involved in that. So far, this is my best thought on it. Doing something like that in the atrium. That's just a very crude rendition of it. We would do something, but the whole concept is look up to the sky and we restore the stars up there. All right, show and tell time, just a second. So, coinage. Let's set this over here and have you all come by. But these are the coins that were recovered from the courthouse. And so I was able to get it out of safe today. So I'm trusting you folks. So I'm going to put this. I know. Right there, you're going to be. Okay, what sort of questions we got? Gideon.
Charlie, what happened to the terrazzo inlay in the main lobby of Bay Street that had a map of the county and the St. Johns River?
I don't think that was preserved. You mean the floor inlay?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't preserved. Now, there were some wall sculptures. There was the outline of Duval County that is over the state attorney's office now. I'm trying to think of what else is there. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was looking to the future. I'm remembering shortly after I retired, being part of a planning group because they were going to put in all this wonderful landscaping in front of the new courthouse. Nothing seems to have happened. That's it.
Well, there is a provision under city ordinance that a certain percentage of the construction process can go for artwork. And that process has still been ongoing because the thing is, that area is so massive. Even the percentage that's available might not do it justice. So I've been involved in to some extent. I'm hoping something will be done eventually to do some artwork out in front of the courthouse. But that's always a ticklish thing of what sort of art. There have been some proposals that I couldn't agree with.
A few trees would be nice.
No, it would be nice.
Actually, yeah, I think the problem is that the sheriff said you can't plant more trees around the courthouse, even though the federal courthouse has trees right next to it. And the city said, and don't plant anything that we can't maintain with a weed trimmer and a lawnmower.
Trees are palm trees.
I can tell you from North Georgia. All right. Anyway. Any other questions? Yes.
Would you say that Jacksonville's legal history, any of this history is available to the public? Is it on display anywhere where it's accessible?
Well, let me tell you, in all the time capsule stuff, here's my plan for that. I want to work with the clerk's office to do a display in the jury assembly room. I've already talked with them about it. And it's just getting a designer and the money to get cabinetry and put it in And I think it'd be a great educational thing for jurors who come in. We have hundreds of jurors come in every criminal court week. And they sit there and, there's not much to do. If they haven't brought a book, they're in trouble. And so I think this would be a great display. Yes?
I just want to say thank you for more electrical outlets in the courthouse and the new courthouse, because we got so tired of only 2 outlets in the old courthouse with the gaffer's tape and the extension cords.
That's improvement in code. Yes?
I remember when they were building that last courthouse, they had an accident on the elevator.
Right.
And years after that, I never felt safe going up in that elevator.
Well, it was a construction elevator outside instead of the elevators inside where they died. And in fact, there was a dedication plaque on the Market Street side about them, and that was removed. And I think it's in the clerk's office, if I'm not correct, in there. So, yeah, that was a pretty tragic event. Yes.
Speaking of tragic events, you should tell the whole story about the shooting in the bathroom in the judge's chambers in the old courthouse.
I only know that about third hand.
Say it again?
I only know that third hand.
Oh. Well, I know it's
Well, let's find an eyewitness.
Oh, I don't know.
Is there any kind of group that is formed to donate funds to preserving your courthouse history?
No.
Should there be?
Well, I view that this is a city responsibility, and it's our association, I think, would be interested in helping. We were able to save a lot of portraits and things like that for the bar offices in the new courthouse, so they owe me. But I think hopefully at some point through coordination with the clerk's office in the city, maybe we can get some funding to do a really good display, top notch.
And cultural arts too.
Yes,
Cultural arts.
and I've talked with the museum downtown. They were the ones that did that kind of quick sketch-o-matic for me. Yeah, Trace.
Does anyone know why there was a plaque for Daniel Boone in
Yes,
front of the old courthouse?
I do.
What happened to it?
I know, yes, I do. Okay, there's a thing called the Daniel Boone Trail. And that was one of, I think, hundreds of plaques that were put normally around courthouses on this. It wasn't exactly where Daniel Boone had been or traveled, but it was commemorated. If he'd come close to a city, they would put one in a courthouse. And so there's a little thing indicating that part of the casting of it was from metal taken from the USS Maine that was blown up in Havana Harbor. But anyway, there's a website. If you go on Wikipedia and put on Daniel Boone Trail, you'll see the whole history and all the locations. Ours was originally put at the 1902 courthouse and was moved to the front of the Bay Street courthouse. And I knew since it was bronze it wouldn't last, and so that's another thing we took, and it's next to Long Liberty in the bottom of the courthouse. Yes?
Outside the 1950s courthouse, there was an eternal flame that I'm not sure if it was a memorial to the people killed, the construction workers killed in the accident, or if it was like a police officer.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember that. It was for the workers who were killed. I'm trying to remember how many it was. 8?
5.
It was, what did I be at?
Apparently that didn't make it to the new courthouse.
No. All right. We good?
So one other thing that's interesting to note is that after they blew up City Hall, the Blackstone building still has plywood in the windows that blew out across the street.
Yeah.
That's preservation of costs.
Yes, right, exactly.
I tell you what, I'll take these coins back there to the picture table in a moment, and if y'all want to sit and try to look through them.
Thanks to Judge Cofer for that great presentation. representing the general contractor for the 1956 courthouse is the George D. Wachter Construction Company, and it's my pleasure to introduce current JHS, Jacksonville Historical Society Board Chair, G. David Wachter IV, who's with us. Jay, would you stand up, please? Dave, of course, the fourth generation of that construction firm with tremendous roots in Jacksonville and whose fingerprints are on so much of downtown and Duval County more generally. I'd like to thank all of you for being here for this presentation. And before we wrap up, I apologize. I think almost everybody had trouble navigating their way in here. Parking sometimes is difficult. It was particularly strange tonight because of conflicting events. We just found out at 3 this afternoon that the usual grass parking lot out back was unavailable to us. So my regrets. We run into those conflicts here in the Sports and Entertainment District because when we took over this property as its stewards in 1998, there was very little going on here on the east side of Jacksonville, and now we've become victims of the success of this neighborhood. It's not the worst thing in the world to have happen, but it does make for some conflicts at times. We do our best to deconflict, so my regrets if you experience difficulty getting there. But if you've still got an appetite, you're undeterred, tomorrow evening the Jacksonville Historical Society will host here at Old St. Andrew's Church an opening reception for a history conference organized by the History Honor Society at the University of North Florida, Phi Alpha Theta. And at the reception tomorrow evening, there will be representatives of the other institutions of higher learning here in Jacksonville, other local history organizations, some of our own staff and volunteers and others associated with other local organizations. It's open to the public. There will be refreshments, some entertainment, and it starts at 6 o'clock and runs until 8:30. We'd be honored to have you with us if you can join us for that. And please stay tuned through our website and through our electronic newsletter for announcements of upcoming programs. We aim for a great year of educational representation of Jacksonville's history. We are now in Jacksonville's 201st year of existence as a city known by that name. And it's all up and better from here on out, right? We're lucky to be in this great city. Thanks very much for all of you for being here. Welcome. See you next time soon. Thanks for Jacksonville.